God Bless Your Way, A Christmas Journey by Emily Freeman. Micah was going back. The way had been long and wearing, and the day was coming to a close. 5 days earlier, the old man had packed a small knapsack with the few necessities his poor income would allow. Then he had set off with the crowd of country people who had been ordered by the king to return to the town where they had been born. Micah walked on the uneven edge of the road so he wouldn't get in anyone's way. Just in front of him, a young woman, heavy with child, rode on the back of a donkey. Her husband led the way, walking slowly to make the ride smoother. They had kept this slow pace all the way from Nazareth, and Micah had followed closely behind. As he walked, Micah thought about the young woman. He could tell that the baby would arrive any day now, and yet the couple traveled with very any belongings. He wondered if the young mother and her new baby would have everything they needed. The woman was beautiful and kind. Every so often she would turn toward Micah, offering a smile of gentle encouragement as he plodded along behind them. And each time they stopped for water, she made sure that her husband offered Micah a sip. A familiar ache filled his heart as he watched them. Micah and his wife had always wanted a child, but after many years they realized that it wasn't meant to be. After his wife died, the house was left empty. It had been a long time since anyone had looked after Micah. As the sun took its place in the west, the weary man rounded the final bend. The town of Bethlehem lay before him, its streets full to overflowing with exhausted travelers, each anxious to find shelter and rest. Feeling the familiar ache that often tugged at his lonely heart, Micah lifted his arm to wave farewell to the young couple. Then, after pausing to search for his direction, he entered the bustling town. Dust was filling his sandals as he wandered his way through the streets. The night air had turned crisp and chilly, and Micah was hoping to find something to eat and a warm place to stay for the night. Finally, he found the narrow alleyway he had been looking for. Nestled at the very end, almost hidden by the drooping green and silvery leaves of the olive trees, was the inn. It seemed warm and inviting. Soft light from the window danced off the rustling leaves. Aching with exhaustion, Micah made his way past the gnarled trunks of the ancient trees to the heavy wooden door of the inn. He took a deep breath and was just about to knock when the door suddenly opened. Before he could say a word, the innkeeper's wife hastily gave the message that she had repeated over and over that evening. "I have nothing to offer." Then she paused to look at the frail and weary traveler. One glance told her everything she needed to know. Her eyes filled with sad kindness, and she tenderly whispered, "Oh, I wish I could do something more." She knew the tiny pouch he carried could not possibly contain anything to keep him warm through the cold night. She put her hand on his shoulder and said, "I'll be back in just a moment. Wait here by the door." The woman returned inside. She quickly looked through every cupboard and above each closet, but the guests had taken all of the bedding. Finally, she went into her own room. She paused, considering her decision, and then took the wool blanket she had woven by hand from her bed before returning to the door. "All I have is this blanket. If you want it, it's yours to take," she told Micah as she reached to drape the heavy blanket over his shoulders. Michael drooped his gaze in humble gratitude and turned to go. She watched him walk slowly down the narrow path, the hem of her blanket hanging just above the straps of his worn sandals. As he shuffled out from under the shelter of the trees and into the crowded street, she called after him, "Good luck on your journey, and God bless your way." Slipping into the crowd of travelers, the old man could feel warm tears of gratitude welling in his eyes. He sighed deeply and, trying not to cry, peered up and down the busy street. There must be a place somewhere in this town that had a warm dinner waiting and soft bed to sleep in. Then the glow of a flickering candle from across the street caught his eye. Through an open window, he watched as a family gathered. The table was meagerly spread, but the warm smiles and animated conversation filled Micah with a familiar longing. He wondered if this humble family might make room for one more. Gathering all of his courage, Micah stepped to the door of the tiny home and knocked. The door opened, and with every ounce of remaining hope, Micah asked the man for shelter for the evening. The man softly replied, "We have nothing to offer." He opened the door wider to reveal a house filled to bursting. Belongings from the guests who had come to stay were piled deep in every corner. I wish we could do something, but as you can see, there is no room. The man glanced at Michael's wrinkled face and wondered how long it had been since the old man's last meal. Then, looking closely into Micah's disappointed eyes, he said, "I'll be back in just a moment, if you'll wait by the door." The man went back to the table where his family sat waiting for dinner and knelt beside his wife. Her eyes filled with compassion as she listened and, without speaking, nodded her head. The man reached to the center of the table and picked up a loaf of bread that his wife had spent the afternoon preparing. "All we have is this simple bread," he said as he returned to the door, handing Micah the warm loaf wrapped in cloth. "If you want it, it is yours to take." Micah quietly thanked the man. In his heart, he knew this gift came as a great sacrifice. The man placed a strong hand on Micah's back to steady him as he walked the old man down the step and bade him farewell. "Good luck on your journey," he said. Then he took Michael's wrinkled hand in his and added, "And God bless your way." It was very late now. The city was settling down for the evening, and Micah walked the nearly deserted streets until he reached the outskirts of town. Wrapped in the wool blanket and carrying the loaf of bread, he looked around. He would have to spend this night, as he had so many others, alone. The Bethlehem fields where the shepherds watched their sheep were lit up with starry brightness. The light led Micah to a terraced path just outside the city. Up ahead, a flickering lamp hung over the open entry of a small stable. The glow of the soft light was welcoming, and he stepped into the rustic shelter, feeling a welcome warmth the first time that night. But what Micah found was not at all what he had expected. A hush of wonder filled his heart. In a wooden manger, a newborn infant lay, freshly swaddled and nestled in a bed of straw. His mother, weary but content, lay next to the makeshift cradle, gazing at the tiny boy. Her husband sat close by, gently stroking her hand. He looked up at Micah, and as their eyes met, Micah realized that this was the young couple he had followed from Nazareth. Not wanting to intrude, he quickly backed out of the doorway. But before he could turn, the young man jumped to his feet and put his arm around Micah, leading him back inside. Gratitude overwhelmed Micah as he realized this couple would not turn him away, but he quickly bowed his head in regret, knowing there was nothing he could do to show his appreciation for their kindness. Then he remembered the bread and the blanket he had received earlier that evening. Perhaps God had blessed Micah's way after all. What had come from humble sacrifice now became heartfelt gifts. Lifting the hand-woven blanket from his shoulders, Micah walked over to the mother, tenderly covering her in its warmth. Then he handed the loaf of bread to her husband. "This is all I have to offer," he apologized. "How I wish I could give you much more." Then he knelt by the manger and leaned to kiss the baby on his head. "Your mother is kind and gentle," he whispered, remembering the journey from Nazareth. "Your father let me in the door." He stroked the infant's soft cheek with the back of his crooked finger, pondering what the young couple had just told him about the tiny boy. "They said you're from heaven," he said with wonder in his voice, "and that you've been sent here for my sake." And with that, the tears he had been holding back all evening finally spilled down the old man's weathered cheeks. His soft sobs filled the silence of the small stable, and as he cried, the tiny baby's eyes turned and found Micah's weary face. At once, Michael felt the ache lift from his lonely heart. With a nod from the child's mother, Micah picked up the small bundle and held it close. It was the first time Micah had ever held a baby so small. Warmth and comfort filled his heart, and suddenly Micah knew that he would never be lonely again. Gently rocking the baby, Micah could faintly hear a chorus of voices echoing over the Bethlehem plains. "Glory to God in the highest, and on earth peace, goodwill toward men." He looked down at the small child nestled in his arms and quietly whispered, "Good luck on your journey, and God bless your way."